Okay, so you want to own Jacob Fugger's fortune. Do the math and it checks out. Silver mines, copper monopolies, kings on the payroll, the richest personal balance sheet Europe had ever seen. You're not wrong, but the empire you think you're buying into isn't yours. It belongs to the men you lent the money to, and they can cancel your ownership with a single decree. That's not a technicality, that's the whole business model. By the end of this, you'll know what it actually cost to buy into the Fugger machine. And it wasn't only money. You'll see the exact formula behind how a wool merchant's grandson out-earned every king in Europe, and where every florin of it truly came from. You'll learn why his own family lost most of that fortune within one generation, using the same playbook that built it. And you'll understand why Fugger's fortune was never really a fortune at all. It was a claim, and claims can be revoked. There's also a clause buried in his biggest deal that could have personally ruined him. We're getting to it. There were 3 ways into this business, and only one of them made you the richest man alive. At the bottom, you were a mine operator, sitting on a real deposit in the Tyrolean Alps with no way to work it. Drainage, ventilation shafts, smelting furnaces. None of it was cheap, and you didn't have the cash. So you borrowed against ore you hadn't dug up yet from a lender who was happy to wait because waiting was the plan. This tier cost you almost nothing up front and eventually cost you the mine. One rung up, you pooled capital with a partner who had something you didn't. In 1494, a mining engineer named Johannes Thurso held the rights to a promising copper deposit at Nusol, in what's now Slovakia, plus a technique for pulling silver out of copper ore that tripled its value. A process Nuremberg smelters had guarded as a trade secret for a century. He didn't have the money to build it out. Jacob Fugger did. They signed a 16-year joint venture, and within a year, the partnership was already buying a second mine. This tier bought you real income on someone else's technical knowledge. At the top, you didn't buy a mine, you bought a monarch. In 1519, the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire treated the imperial crown as an open auction, and the going rate to outbid the King of France was roughly 850,000 gold florins. Historians also call this same coin a guilder or a gulden, so don't let the names throw you later. Fugger personally put up 543,000 of it, nearly 2/3, with the Welser banking family and a handful of Italian houses covering the rest. Put that in terms a laborer of the period would recognize. 1 florin was about a month's wages. Fugger's share of that single bribe was worth something like 45,000 years of an ordinary working life spent on one election. Nobody warns you what that tier actually buys, beyond the crown. 3 costs get buried in the fine print of every deal like it. First, canon law still technically banned charging interest on a loan. So before you can collect a return at all, you need the Pope's blessing, not just the emperor's. Second, your collateral is only as good as your ability to make someone honor it, and there's no court above a king. Third, once your exposure to a single ruler gets large enough, you can't quietly walk away. Pulling out would collapse the value of everything you're already owed, so withdrawal becomes as dangerous as staying in. One number from this tier is worth remembering for later, because it's smaller than you'd expect for a deal that bought an empire. The entire Fugger investment in Tyrolean silver between 1487 and 1494, before any of this scaled up, came to just over 400,000 gold gulden. The election bribe alone was bigger than that. So where did the money actually come from? Because it wasn't interest. Picture a pawn shop, except instead of taking your watch as security on a small loan, the shop takes the deed to the factory that makes the watches and keeps it even after you pay the loan back. That's roughly what Fugger did to the operators he financed. He didn't want cash repayment because canon law made cash interest legally awkward and politically dangerous to collect. So instead of a loan you paid off, he structured the deal as a cux, a mining share, which made him a part owner of the operation itself, permanently, and locked the mine into selling its output exclusively through him. A debt that was supposed to end became equity that never did. Now watch the scale. A single shipment of Hungarian copper, refined and sold through the Fugger network, was worth a few hundred florins in tolls and margin, unremarkable on its own. But by 1502, the Fugger-Thurzo partnership had over 1 million Hungarian florins sunk into that operation, and the silver extracted as a byproduct of worthless copper ore was generating something close to 2 million florins on its own. The trick wasn't the margin on any single shipment, it was owning the pipe that every shipment in the region had to pass through for decades, while European demand for copper and silver kept climbing. The part that actually surprises people is this: mining wasn't even Fugger's most reliable stream. The church was. When Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz needed money to buy his own promotion, Fugger lent it to him and got repaid out of an indulgence-selling campaign, the same one that would later provoke Martin Luther. The mechanism was almost comically controlled. The donation chest used 2 separate locks, one key held by a church official, one by a Fugger agent, so the box could only be opened with both men present. Every florin that went in, a Fugger representative watched leave. His cut was 3% of the entire operation. None of this worked without a second trick underneath it, getting paid before the risk even landed. When Emperor Maximilian needed 170,000 florins to fund a war in Italy, he didn't just promise to repay it, he pledged the entire silver output of the Tyrolean mines as security. If Maximilian defaulted, Fugger didn't have to sue anyone. He just kept mining and kept selling, and the debt paid itself out of the ground. Do that enough times with enough mines, and you stop being a lender who occasionally forecloses. You become an owner who occasionally lends. By the mid-1490s, that pattern had compounded into a near monopoly. Fugger owned the mines, controlled the smelting, and ran the trade routes, all at once, a combination no rival could match even by matching any single piece of it, with Hungarian copper traveling as far as Antwerp, Lisbon, and eventually India. It all reduces to one sentence. Income equals how many desperate borrowers you can find, times how much collateral you can extract from each one, times how long you can hold that collateral before someone with more power takes it back. Almost everything else in this business, the titles, the marriages, the church donations, the flattery of emperors, existed for one purpose: buying more time on that third factor because it was the only one Fugger didn't fully control, which raises the question this whole video keeps circling back to: if every one of those revenue streams was seized, leveraged, or extracted rather than simply bought outright, what did Fugger actually own? You've probably heard of a company town where the same employer owns the factory, the store, and the house you sleep in, so you never really leave its orbit. Fugger built the aristocratic version of that. 3 centuries early, and almost nobody he dealt with saw the whole shape of it at once. Start with the mine operators. The Cuck's share wasn't just a clever legal workaround for interest bans, it was a leash. Once you'd sold Fugger a Cuck's, you weren't allowed to sell your ore to whichever buyer offered the best price that week. You sold it to him at his price, because he was now your part owner and your only sanctioned customer. Competing operators who hadn't taken his money couldn't match his logistics network, so even the mines Fugger didn't formally own often ended up funneling ore through his smelters and his ships anyway. There's a pattern worth naming, even without a period-accurate word for it. Instead of accepting a vague royal promise to repay, Fugger insisted wherever possible on pledges against one specific physical revenue stream: a mining district's output, a set of customs tolls, something with a name and a location that could actually be seized if things went wrong. A promise on its own could not. The double-locked indulgence chest from the last section wasn't a one-off either. It was the template. Wherever Fugger extended credit to an institution he didn't fully trust, he embedded a physical control point inside their own cash handling process, so he never had to rely on anyone's word about how much money had actually come in. And there was a VIP tier above even the mine operators and the archbishops, the Habsburgs themselves. Access to Maximilian and then Charles V was worth more than any single loan, because it came with status that protected every other deal in the portfolio. In 1511, Fugger was elevated into the nobility. In 1514, he was made a count. Neither of those titles paid a florin directly. Both of them made every prince in Europe think twice before treating his contracts as optional. The clearest proof of how this VIP architecture worked came right at the end of Fugger's life. In Woodorah 1525, months before he died, he lent Charles V 560,000 florins for a 3-year lease on the Maestrazgo mine in Spain. The largest mercury deposit on Earth. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Mercury was the one input Spain's own colonial silver refineries in the Americas couldn't do without. By controlling it, Fugger wasn't just Charles's banker anymore. He held a choke point on the very silver rush the Spanish crown was counting on to eventually pay him back. If the machine really was this well secured, here's the obvious question. Why did people who ran versions of this business keep going broke? The short answer is everything else. Start with the costs that are at least predictable. Skilled labor for smelting was scarce and jealously guarded. The Sager process that made Hungarian copper so profitable had taken Nuremberg refiners nearly a century to protect as trade secret before Fugger's partners got hold of it, and every operation that used it needed workers who actually understood it. Add the logistics of moving ore by land, river, and sea across half of Europe, plus a running political cost. Keeping the church's blessing for what was functionally interest-bearing lending required continuous, expensive diplomacy with Rome. There's a cost that doesn't show up on any balance sheet either. Secrecy itself was expensive. Fugger's firm kept its mining technology and its production numbers under lock and key precisely because a monopoly this profitable was also a monopoly everyone else wanted to break. And enforcing that kind of secrecy across dozens of sites for decades took its own quiet layer of spending and internal policing. It also earned him enemies. He was formally accused of usury and monopolistic practices in his own lifetime, serious enough charges that he needed Charles V personally to shield him from them, which he only could because of the leverage described a moment ago. Then come the costs nobody budgets for. When Fugger's silent partner in the Tyrolean mines, a cardinal named Melchior von Mechau, died unexpectedly in 1509, his estate triggered competing claims from the Pope, the local bishopric, and Mechau's own family, any one of which could have stripped Fugger of operational control over assets he'd spent 2 decades building. And there's a detail that rarely makes it into the spreadsheets. Fugger survived an actual poisoning attempt in the course of doing this business, which is a reminder that collateralized and secure never meant safe. Which brings us to the clause we teased earlier. Every one of these loans to a sovereign was structured with unlimited personal liability, not corporate distance. When Fugger reminded the newly crowned Charles V, in plain terms, that the crown itself only existed because of his money, that wasn't flattery. It was a debt collector's warning, because if that debt ever went bad, it wasn't a bank's balance sheet that absorbed the loss. It was Jacob Fugger's own personal fortune, on the hook, with no employer, no shareholders, and no bankruptcy court with jurisdiction over an emperor to hide behind. That's the actual shape of this business once you strip away the mining monopolies and the royal titles. One guaranteed number, the value of whatever collateral you'd physically seized, sitting next to an unguaranteed everything else. The labor, the logistics, the church's mood, a partner's sudden death, and the temperament of whichever king currently owed you a fortune he didn't have to repay. Own was never quite the right word for any of this, and it's about to get worse before it gets better. 2 mistakes killed businesses like this one over and over, and neither of them was bad luck. The first was chasing a bigger score outside the model that actually worked. In 1528, the Welser family of Augsburg, Fugger's own hometown rivals, wealthy from the exact same mining and lending playbook, took a concession from Charles V to colonize Venezuela and mine whatever riches were rumored to be there. It wasn't collateralized lending anymore. It was a speculative land grab dressed up in the same financial language. 3 governors, and 18 years later, the crown revoked the charter in 1546, after one of the Welser agents was executed in a dispute with a rival Spanish conquistador. The family's losses from the venture are estimated at 3 million florins. more than Fugger's entire personal stake in the imperial election that made him famous. The Augsburg House of Welser never fully recovered, and the firm finally collapsed in bankruptcy in 1614. The rule: if your edge is knowing how to secure a real named revenue stream, betting on a rumor of gold in unmapped jungle is a different business. Wearing your logo. The second mistake killed the Fuggers themselves, one generation after Jacob. It wasn't a single bad bet. It was refusing to diversify away from a client who kept showing warning signs. By the 1550s, the family's fortunes were tied overwhelmingly to one debtor, the Spanish crown. That's the equivalent of parking your entire retirement account with the one customer who's already asked to skip 3 payments in a row because he'd been your best customer for 30 years and surely wouldn't actually default. In 1557, Philip II suspended payments on his debts outright. It happened again in 1575, again in 1596, again in 1607. Between the first default and Anton Fugger's death in 1560 alone, the family's net worth is estimated to have collapsed from roughly 2 million guilders to around 200,000, a loss of about 90% in 3 years. Each time, first under Philip II, then under the kings who followed him, Madrid offered a way out, converting short-term debt into long-term state bonds called juros, paying a lower fixed rate instead of one lump repayment rather than refusing outright. The Fuggers took the deal every time, because the alternative, a total loss on money already lent, was worse. That's what made the trap so effective. Never a clean betrayal you could walk away from. Just a slow bleed you kept choosing to absorb one restructuring at a time. Even the fallout from Spain's other debts followed them for a century. When the Netherlands broke away from Spanish rule, the arrears owed to the Fuggers on that front alone are estimated at 1.5 million ducats, a different Spanish gold coin from the florins and guilders used elsewhere in this story. The rule: a debtor with no higher court above him and an army under him isn't a client. He's the landlord in this arrangement, and a landlord sets the terms of the lease whenever he feels like it, not when a contract says he has to. The branch of the family everyone forgets is the one that actually survived this business long term. The retreat started before Anton Fugger even died, and every step of it reads like a lesson he was teaching himself in real time. The firm quietly pulled out of Hungarian copper mining in 1548, years before the first Spanish default, an exit while the market was still profitable, made because Anton could already see it attracting too much competition and too much royal attention to stay clean. When he died in 1560, his son Marx inherited a firm still bleeding from that default and read the wound correctly. A single crown had become too large a share of the book, and the crown, not the lender, gets to decide what too large means. So Marx capped it, wound down Spanish exposure over the following decades, and finally exited all Spanish leasing by 1647, nearly a century after Jacob's death. Rather than plowing recovered capital back into more sovereign debt, he and his brothers converted it into land around Swabia. For the plainest reason there is, land doesn't declare bankruptcy and it doesn't die and trigger a succession dispute the way a royal debtor or a childless partner can. There's a difference between running one loan and running this as an actual business. One loan is a job you hope gets repaid. A business is a portfolio you're willing to rebalance, even when it means walking away from your best customer. It's the same instinct behind the housing project you'll hear about at the end of this. Keep something whose value has nothing to do with any single client's solvency. And it's a pattern worth watching for because once you notice it here, you'll start noticing it in every other empire built the same way. But rebalancing on its own doesn't explain the strangest part of this whole story: how the reckless bet and the disciplined retreat both came out of the exact same playbook. Step back for a second, because here's the paradox at the center of all of it. This machine was, genuinely, the most reliable financial system 16th century Europe had ever seen. Physical collateral, named revenue streams, double-locked strongboxes, decades of compounding mining monopolies. None of that was an illusion. It worked exactly as designed for over a century, and it still produced serial bankruptcies at the very top of the pyramid because reliability and fragility were coming from the same place. Compare it to an ordinary bakery down the street. A bakery has no monopoly, no royal collateral, no elegant financial engineering, but it also has no single point of failure the size of a king. If one customer stops paying, the bakery survives. If your single largest counterparty is a sovereign with an army and no one above him, there's no backstop, no regulator, no court that can force him to honor the deal. The same feature that made this business the safest bet in Europe, collateral so good you'd bet an empire on it, also meant that when it failed at a scale no ordinary business ever could. So the actual trade at the heart of Jacob Fugger's fortune was this: guaranteed collateral against an entirely unguaranteed everything else, most of all the political survival of the man who owed you money. Fugger himself made that trade and won. The people who inherited it made the same trade and, eventually, lost. What that trade paid the ones who won it right is where this ends. So, how much would you actually have made if you'd played this right? The modest version looks almost dull by comparison to everything you've just heard. You take a cuck stake in an established mine, not a brand new prospect, alongside a partner who already has technical expertise. You don't. The way the Thurzo family did before eventually handing their remaining Hungarian trade shares to the Fuggers outright in 1526. Your capital is modest, your income is a share of a real, physical, ongoing operation, and your risk is bounded by the fact that you never became any single ruler's personal creditor. It's the version of this business that's scuffed, unglamorous, and, as the Thurzo name still on a building in Slovakia today proves, still standing 500 years later. The top version is what Jacob Fugger actually did. Put the majority of his liquid fortune, 543,000 florins, into a single imperial election, backed by decades of mining monopolies as collateral for the risk. The return, on paper, was almost absurd. By his death in 1525, the balance sheet of Jacob Fugger and nephews showed assets over 3 million guilders against liabilities under 900,000, a net worth around 2 million guilders. Payback on the election bet itself took roughly 6 years, measured from the 1519 vote to his death, with the mining leases still compounding underneath everything else he owned. But here's the twist inside the top scenario that the modest one never gets near. The real payoff was never the guilders. It was forcing the Catholic Church to formally soften centuries of doctrine against charging interest because the Church needed Fugger's money too badly to keep calling it a sin. And that single shift in doctrine, not the mining monopolies, is the part of this business that's still running in every interest-bearing loan issued anywhere in the world today. The aspirational figure here is Fugger himself. Born in 1459 to a family of Augsburg cloth weavers, dead in 1525 as, by some estimates, the richest private individual who has ever lived, in inflation-adjusted terms. One biographer puts the number at around $400 billion in today's money, a fortune equal to roughly 2% of an entire continent's economy, concentrated in one person's hands, a share nobody has matched since. So, do you actually get to own Jacob Fugger's fortune? No. Nobody did. Not even Jacob Fugger. He just got to rent an empire from the men who ran it, at an exceptional rate for about 25 years. And unlike almost everyone who tried the same trade after him, he had the good sense to stop collecting before the landlord asked for it back.